Hello, everybody. It's Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat, and it is now the Tuesday, the 27th of April, 2021. Click on the subscriber button below and the notification bell in the upper right to be a subscriber to these episodes and be notified when an episode is released. Today's topic is, did the Republican carpetbag regimes in the South during Reconstruction manipulate the ex-slave vote? So let me get started with that. Today's academics dismiss claims that carpetbaggers manipulated the ex-slave vote during Reconstruction. Nonetheless, the Republican regimes in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and perhaps others, collapsed as their leaders fought among themselves over the spoils of the political control, ultimately splitting their party into two factions. In Arkansas, they literally became two warring factions in an episode termed the Brooks-Baxter War. Moreover, Republicans so manipulated the ex-slave vote that each side in Arkansas had its own black militia. In short, Arkansas Republicans had blacks killing other blacks to determine which white northerner would control the state's Republican Party and be governor of the state. It all began in the spring of 1868 when former Union Brigadier General Powell, Clayton, was elected to the state's first became the state's first carpetbag governor. Election irregularities were commonplace. Democrats, for example, complained that the number of votes cast in the state's most populous county exceeded the number of registered voters in that county. Even though the district's military commander conceded the irregularities, he validated the results anyway by rationalizing that there would have been voting irregularities regardless of which side won. Consequently, Democrats turned their attention to the autumn general elections, when the U.S. president would be selected along with the state's three congressmen. In response to one political assassination and another attempt, Governor Powell formed a Black Militia. Its tyrannical conduct guaranteed that Republicans would win the autumn elections. When deployed, just as a parenthetical note, when deployed, the militia included some whites, particularly in the northwestern part of the state where few blacks lived. Powell also declared martial law in counties unlikely to vote Republican and threw out their votes even after those votes were tallied. Even though all three congressmen elected were Republicans, two of them would have been defeated without the governor's one-sided intervention. He just went into counties where the Republicans lost and threw out the votes. That's all. That's how he won. Powell's Black Militia terrorized whites in the southern and eastern parts of the state, which were Democrat strongholds. Among the complaints were plundering, arbitrary arrest, and prisoner mistreatment. Even Clayton reluctantly admitted to instances when black militiamen sexually assaulted white women. Arkansas spent $330,000 on the Black Militia during that election and the ensuing months that followed, whereas before the war, the state spent only $100,000 annually for all purposes. White residents especially resented that nearly all the tax burden for such expenses fell upon them as property owners. Many could not afford to pay such taxes and lost their lands to carpetbag buyers in tax delinquency sales. Powell Clayton, for example, eventually accumulated a 40,000-acre plantation. These tax sales, these land sales for tax delinquency were not just fictions like you saw in Gone with the Wind. They really happened. After Clayton moved, and that's why the southern states objected so much to the high property taxes, because the farmers, including the former large landowners, lost their lands because they couldn't pay the taxes. And it was not just the big farmers, also the smaller farmers. But you see, blacks didn't own any land, so they didn't have to pay that tax. After Clayton moved to the Senate, he gradually lost power back in Arkansas. The National Republican Party split into two factions for the 1872 elections. One group, known as the Stalwarts, backed President Grant. The other group, known as the Liberals, nominated newspaperman Horace Greeley as their presidential candidate. Now, the Liberals abandoned Grant for several reasons. They opposed him for several reasons. First and foremost, they wanted civil service reform to minimize the corruption that accompanied political appointments. All of this corruption was just starting to become evident, but they wanted to stop it, with civil service reform. They also objected to the railroad land giveaways that included acreage to the Northern Pacific Railroad, equivalent in size to the entire state of Missouri. Jay Cooke, who managed that railroad, was President Grant's largest campaign contributor. Finally, liberal Republicans wanted to give former Confederates the right to hold elective office. In many cases, if you were a former Confederate officer, you could not hold office. And the region sent its best men to the Confederate Army during the Civil War. The natural leaders went to join that army out of a sense of loyalty. And these men were not given the right to hold office. So that's really what the Confederates, ex-Confederates wanted, and the liberal Republicans were willing to adopt such a policy. Powell Clayton backed the stalwart wing, which was represented in Arkansas by the gubernatorial candidate, Elisha Baxter. And Baxter was opposed by another carpetbagger named Joseph Brooks. Since the Baxter faction controlled the election machinery, he won the election. Surprise. Brooks nonetheless filed a couple of lawsuits charging fraud. He promptly lost the higher profile suit, while the second one languished in a lower court and would probably not have gone anywhere until something happened. And here's what happened. After Baxter took office, he angered Clayton by attacking rail promoters who, for recklessly issuing too many state-guaranteed bonds to finance the construction of the railroads in the state. Attempts by the companies to force Arkansas to accept stock instead of cash as repayment for those bonds triggered Baxter's objection. I mean, giving them stock that's worthless is worthless. It's a total waste of whatever amount of the face value of the bonds are. It's total waste. Ultimately, every Reconstruction era railroad in Arkansas financed in this manner defaulted on its interest payments. Construction costs were unaccountably high, as were the bond sales commissions. There can be no doubt that much of the excess went into the pockets of the promoters. Clayton quickly switched sides in the gubernatorial dispute. In April 1874, 18 months after the election, he got the obscure county court to suddenly wake up. Suddenly it wakes up after doing nothing for 18 months, and it declared Brooks the winner of the 1872 election. Accompanied by 10 armed men on April 15th, Brooks physically ousted Baxter from the governor's office in a coup d'etat. From a nearby hotel, Baxter sent out a call to the Black Militia for volunteers to report for active duty. Brooks likewise sent out a call for militia volunteers to defend his occupation of the State House. In other words, both of them are pretending to be governor. Both of them calling the Black Militia to provide troops, and hundreds, possibly thousands of white and black men showed up at the state capitol of Little Rock to support their candidate. Federal troops from the nearby arsenal temporarily kept them apart. Eventually, however, the tension resulted in at least two armed engagements. One was on the 30th of April at New Gascony, where about 200 of Baxter's blacks defeated a like number of Brooks's blacks. Ex-slaves fighting ex-slaves to decide which northern white man goes to the governor's mansion. The now vanished town was 15 miles from present-day Pine Bluff. The Brooks contingent lost 9 killed and 20-odd wounded, whereas Baxter's forces had only 4 casualties. A week later, Brooks's troops won a battle. Baxter sent 40 men on a riverboat a short distance upstream from Little Rock on the Arkansas River to intercept a shipment of arms to Brooks at the State House, destined for the State House. Even though the movement began at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Brooks forces saw it and sent 200 of their own men ahead to a place called Palarm Creek by railroad, where they ambushed the riverboat. Their shots quickly disabled the boat, which drifted to the far bank of the river. Under relentless fire, 3 of the 40 men aboard were killed, and nearly all of the others were wounded. Most Arkansas taxpayers were outraged to fund this ridiculous affair that resulted in the state militia fighting against itself. The state black militia fighting against itself. The Brooks-Baxter War added another $200,000 to the state's black militia operating expenses. Ultimately, both sides appealed for recognition from the national government, forcing Congress to establish a committee to investigate Arkansas affairs. Acting upon a legal opinion from Attorney General George Williams, Grant selected Baxter as the winner, but appointed Brooks as Little Rock's postmaster on the 15th of May. In the end, the Republican fiasco put Arkansas Democrats back in power after Baxter decided to help the former Confederates regain the right to vote. There would be a new constitution, which would actually give the former Confederates a right to vote. And in the state of Arkansas, many of them had been disfranchised, far more than were disfranchised by the national 14th Amendment. So that's the situation. They actually, the Republicans in Arkansas actually got ex-slaves to fight against ex-slaves to see which white Northerner would go to the governor's office. Now, blacks can have endemic intelligence, just like whites do. I'm not saying they're not intelligent, but they were manipulated because, number one, they were inexperienced with politics, and number two, they were largely illiterate and easily led by a party that promised to give them money for simply doing their bidding. But they went to they went to the militia. They got paid to kill one another. Not many, but they actually did, and they shot guns at one another. So let's go ahead and I want to show you something here that I think it could be significant. Here we go. Oops, wrong thing. All right. If you want to learn more about this Reconstruction era, I recommend that you get my book, U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. It's $20 at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, and $22 if you want, it's $22 at Amazon's and Barnes & Noble. If you want an autographed copy, you can get an autographed copy from me. If you live in the States, it'll be $25, and I will pay the postage. If you want an autographed copy, you need to email me, Phil, PHIL _ Leigh, LEIGH at me.com. And so I'll get it off to you. But stories like what the Brooks-Baxter War, it's all in there, and you'll be able to learn more about it. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.